Okay. So hello everyone, thanks very much for coming. I'm Richard and this is Rob. This presentation is really about the way that authenticity is conceptualized and the way that connects with the idea of what a native speaker is. This paper is kind of based on an article that Rob and I co-authored, which is in Applied Linguistics Review, in which we kind of put forward a theoretical framework about how the concept of authenticity is, I suppose, misappropriated and it's either directly or indirectly associated with this kind of image of native speakers. So we put forward this framework which looks at connections in both theory and in practice. So what we're going to talk about today, first Rob will explain what native-speakerism is, because he's the expert on that, and then I'll talk about what authenticity is, because that's what my PhD is about. And then we'll talk about first the connections in theory, so authenticity, culturism, and cultural capital. We'll explain what those mean and how they relate to authenticity and native-speakerism. And then we'll talk about connections in practice as well, and we'll try to give you some sort of practical illustrations of how this works. So first of all, what is a native speaker? Well, I'm going to hand over to Rob now, but I just want to point out this is my son. So if you ask him what's his first language, he's not going to say daddy's language or mummy's language. He's bilingual. So is he a native speaker of English? So Rob will talk a little bit more about this.
Yeah, so I think this is an interesting question. I think it depends what sphere you're discussing. In fact, I think we disagree slightly about this.
Yes,
as well.
we might disagree slightly.
So in my opinion, in theoretical linguistics, the native speaker is a kind of a sort of Galilean construct, a scientific concept that's kind of simplified. You can use it to test theories on theories of language acquisition and so forth. In applied linguistics, I think it's more of a social construct. When people say native speaker, especially somewhere like Japan, people often have an image of, for example, a British or American person, a white person, and a speaker of a particular variety of the language. In fact, I did a test recently with my students where I asked them to all close their eyes and sort of vote anonymously. And so I said native speaker, and I asked who thought of a white person, and all the hands went up. So I think there's a very clear kind of social construct element in the term native speaker. I don't think it's particularly clear what native speaker means, but I think certainly in applied linguistics it's more a social than a scientific construct. So now I'll talk about native-speakerism. So native-speakerism is a term that was coined by Adrian Holliday, who's actually my PhD supervisor, in 2003, and then expanded on later in his work. Native-speakerism refers to an ideology in English language teaching where the voices of the West, of Western institutions, and of the Western ELT establishment is privileged over more kind of locally developed models, locally developed techniques, locally developed technologies, and so on. In kind of popular use, this term I think is slightly misappropriated to just mean discrimination against non-native speaker teachers. I think that's slightly wrong, and I think it also runs the risk of masking the larger political implications, because you can have a situation where in this school, all the teachers are being employed, native or non-native, and it doesn't matter, but there's still that underlying assumption of Western native normativity on which everything is based. So I think that native-speakerism is kind of an underlying ideology within the profession, and it has several different effects, which I think we will be focusing on later in the presentation.
I think maybe we should make it clear that native-speakerism is really a form of discrimination, and it's as Rob's already touched on, kind of connected with race and that kind of thing. So it's really something that we want to get rid of as much as possible. So maybe I can just invite participants to just think about what's your experience of native speakerism. Have you felt any prejudice against you as a native or non-native speaker of the language? Which do you identify yourself as? Do you identify yourself as a native speaker or a non-native speaker, or somewhere between these two things, kind of like my son? So my experience of native speakerism, I've experienced native speakerism as both a privilege and as a form of prejudice as well, but mainly as a privilege. So basically I'm in Japan and I'm able to get a pretty good job because I'm a white male person who's from a country whose first language is English. And I'm learning Japanese at the moment, and I'm taking a Japanese test in a month, which I'm going to fail. But you know, my Japanese is not great, to be honest. Even though I'm trying to study, I've got a job at a university, but you know, my Japanese isn't good enough to really contribute to faculty meetings and things. How come I can work there? It's because I'm identified as a native speaker. So this is my experience, and this is me being used to sell the concept of the native speaker at Nova, and here's me grimacing with the Nova Sagi. So yeah, again, this is why I was chosen as a kind of representative of this native speakerism that we're talking about. So anyway, what Rob and I discussed when we were talking about working together was how our research interests meet. So as Rob's already said, he's the expert on native speakerism, and when he told me about his research, I thought, oh, this connects so much with my research on authenticity. I think that when we talk about authenticity in English language teaching, we tend to think of, you know, maybe the classic example is a newspaper from the target language speaking culture. But the problem is that indirectly links authenticity with native speakers, because and there's also a hierarchy of authenticity as well. For example, in most people's minds, the kind of best place to get the newspaper from would be the United States or the UK, and then lower down you might get places like, I don't know, Canada or Australia or something, and then lower down still you might get South Africa. And unfortunate as it is, this hierarchy exists in learners' minds, and it's put there by advertising and that kind of thing, and it's put there by the materials that we use in the class. According to nearly every definition of authenticity, nothing we use in the class is authentic. A textbook, it cannot be authentic. You know, something that you've adapted so that your students will be able to understand it, that's not authentic anymore. But this excludes 99% of the materials we use for teaching. And if you're saying that's not authentic, obviously that's very damaging for our teaching practice. And you're also saying that what we do in the classroom is not authentic. So by focusing on real world or cultural products like this, you're taking away the power to be authentic of your own teaching, and that's the students' learning. So I think this is why I call it the classic definition. Talking about authenticity as something like a newspaper or a film or something, it's like talking about a classic car. Yes, they have an important place in history, and yes, they look nice, but they tend to break down, and they're not really workable in today's globalized world. So I've put forward, my research is really about trying to reconceptualize authenticity as a continuum, which apparently people find hard to understand, but it's supposed to be simple. It's supposed to be an issue that there's no black and white to authenticity. You can't say this is authentic and this is not. Basically, everything has a degree of authenticity, and there are certain types of authenticity, such as social authenticity or individual authenticity. Authenticity as it relates to what you need to learn in order to pass the class, and authenticity as it relates to the real world or the use domain in terms of what you need to be able to interact with people outside of the class. So that's what my research has done, and that's why it connects with Rob's work. So I think it's back to Rob now.
Okay. So as Richard mentioned at the start, in the paper that we wrote, we put forward a theoretical framework for how you can connect the concepts of native speakerism and authenticity. So I'll talk about the framework that we've come up with, at least I'll talk about the theoretical side, I'll hand back to Richard for the practical side. And I want to stress that this is the way that we conceptualise this. We're not saying it's the only way of conceptualising this, and there could be improvements made to this, or adjustments, or even completely new frameworks that people come up with, and that's fine. Please go in and prove us wrong, that's great. So in terms of theory, there are 3 areas that we think bring out the connections between native speakerism and authenticity. The first is authority. Okay, so the idea that the native speaker, the authentic speaker, and the countries and cultures they represent is the authority on the English language. Okay, the authoritative users of the English language, and therefore have more right to be teaching the language, or have more right to be defining the norms of the language. Good. Yes. That connects to culturism. Okay, so culturism is basically a kind of cultural chauvinism, the idea that other cultures can't do it as well. Okay, Adrian Holiday calls this cultural disbelief, the idea that non-native speakers or people from other countries don't have anything to add to the ELT profession, that they're just there as recipients of things being produced and created in the West. So authority, and then culturism, which finally leads to cultural capital. Cultural capital, if any of you have read Pierre Bourdieu, how do you pronounce his name?
Bourdieu.
Bourdieu, okay, there you go. I failed French. So, the idea of cultural capital is how much your cultural knowledge is valued, right? In terms of ELT, this can be manifested in, for example, qualifications, the kind of qualifications people want to get. So I did some research published last year, investigating ELT departments in Japanese universities. And what I found was that even in big ELT programs, which have quite an international mindset, that have a good mix of teachers from Japan, from the States, from the UK, from different European countries, most people got their qualifications in language teaching from the US or the UK. Nearly everyone. I think only one university didn't, but that was kind of a strange case. But in the other cases, nearly everyone had their qualifications from these overseas institutions. And I think that connects very clearly to this idea of authority and culturism, right? These institutions represent the authoritative knowledge, and they represent the authentic culture, and so therefore people go there and study their qualifications in order to prepare for their teaching lives. In terms of practice, I'll hand back.
Thanks very much. So the connections that we identified in practice relate to the perceptions and discrimination that students bring, professional discrimination, negative self-images of people who identify as non-native speaker teachers, and the sales rhetoric that's used. So first of all, discrimination. As I already mentioned, native speakerism is a form of discrimination, and it's very closely connected to linguistic imperialism and racism. And how does this manifest itself? And I think it's in Japan it's an interesting situation because, for example, the idea of standard Japanese is kind of very pervasive throughout Japan. And when people come from the country to Tokyo, they'll try to hide or cover up their accents and form this kind of standard Japanese, which is a product of pieces of a big discussion that took place during the Meiji period. And I think that this also relates to the way that English is perceived as well. And again, this kind of discrimination, if you make a mistake when you're speaking English, or if your English is slightly divergent from the kind of standard, you'll be heavily discriminated against. One other thing is that students tend to have different perceptions of their teachers. So the perception of the Japanese English teacher is that they'll be given grammar drills and, you know, forced to kind of learn things ready for the exam, whereas when you get a foreign teacher, it'll be kind of games and stupid stuff, but not really learning. So, and these, never the twain shall these kind of two images meet. You know, where's the communicative Japanese English teacher, or where's the serious English-speaking teacher? So,
actually, I asked my students to give me some words that they felt described Japanese and foreign teachers, they got lively, cheerful, rhythmical for some reason. I don't know what that means. And for the Japanese teachers, it was boring, old. I don't know why old. But there was a very clear disparity between their views of the two groups. You know.
And this is sold by, as we'll come to, this is part of what the sales rhetoric of language schools is used. And it's not just Japan, but specifically, it's not specifically even Asia. The whole world is kind of it has these kind of ideas. But it seems to be very pervasive, certainly in the Far East. Professional discrimination. So here's an example. You can't read this, but on Facebook recently there was a job post advertised saying, "We are looking for a native speaker of English." I got an email literally yesterday from my mate Dave saying, "We're looking for native speakers." Even though the Japanese law forbids this kind of advertisement because it's discriminatory. And then of course when you get to the job interview, for example, if you're a Singaporean and you want to work in Japan, how are you viewed as a native speaker or not? We have a colleague, somebody we know, Patrick who works in Nagoya, and he has a very interesting story about his experiences reaching to gain employment here. I'm sure many people have also experienced this. The other thing, this is from some research that I've done, doing a workshop on authenticity with Japanese teachers, English teachers at high school. And in the workshop I tried to really open up the concept of authenticity and explain, you know, why it should not be related to native speakers. And this person wrote in their reflective essay at the end of the workshop that before this workshop I thought authentic means newspapers, and they said that they actually had negative self-image because of that. So quite often teachers for whom English is a second language feel that they are discriminated against not only from their students, but quite often indirectly by themselves as well. They'll be more harsh on themselves if they make grammar mistakes, or the students are constantly listening, waiting for them to make some kind of mistake. But when the so-called native speakers make mistakes, nobody cares. So this is something that's been written about, but also something that manifests itself in practice. And then finally, as we've kind of hinted at throughout the talk, the sales rhetoric, the representation that the native speaker is the best teacher, the most authentic model. Look, all our teachers are native speakers. This kind of way of selling the English language, which is really, really terribly discriminatory, and yet it's not really questioned. It's just sort of done and sold, and it's not even necessarily true that students want native speakers. What they want is good teachers.
In terms of the sales rhetoric. It's important to remember that this doesn't, when people use the term native speaker like this, it doesn't really just mean someone who speaks English as a first language. There's a very specific image in the minds of students and schools. For example, I received, similar to Richard, I received an email quite recently from a mailing list which said, "We're looking for native speakers who are under the age of 33. And that was for a university. A real university. So I think that there are all of these assumptions about race, about age, and about nationality that are built into the social construct of the native speaker.
Are you doing the conclusion?
I think you are, because I don't know what that means.
Oh, I don't know either. Well, I like this quote because Abraham Lincoln talks about spending plenty of time to sharpen the axe and not so much time chopping down the tree. I think that we need to sharpen our critical thinking of the way that these kind of presentations influence our professional practices. And also we need to work with the students, whether or not we identify ourselves as native speakers or not. I think we need to work with the students and help them to open their eyes to this terrible discriminatory practice which is permeated throughout the ELT industry. So it's really about analysing things and criticising what is basically very pervasive, and it's going to be a very hard tree to chop down, so we all need to sharpen our axe.
As someone said on a blog that I was reading recently, hegemony is like the weeble. It may wobble, but it will never fall down.
Interesting.
Yeah, good. So if you want to read more about this, obviously please read our article to get a more in-depth treatment of this framework. Yeah, it's this one. It's available, I think it's still available open access from the journal, and it's quite long, and as we all know, the longer an article is, the better, right? So please read that, and also Rich has a book.
Yeah, I talk about Native-Speakerism a little bit in my book, which is coming out, and if you look on my blog, you can get a 50% off voucher for it, so it's actually very, very cheap. They're almost giving them away already. It's been released on the 15th of June.
Okay.
Thank you very much.